Welcome back to another episode of Arbitral Voices, and today is a very special episode because we are in the middle of the FBA moot in Berlin, and I would like to thank Lutz for offering their offices to us. It is even more special because I am joined today by Professor Andrea Bjorklund. Andrea is a full professor and E40 chair in International Arbitration and International Commercial Law at the McGill University in Montreal. Andrea, thank you very much for joining today.
It's a pleasure.
So to begin our conversation, maybe you would like to tell us how did you start your career in international law?
Well, I think like many younger people, many students, I thought I wanted to do international law without really knowing what that meant, which meant when I was in school, I was in law school at Yale, I took every international law class that was offered, which of course helped guide me to some degree. And then I followed the fairly traditional path of getting a job in Washington, D.C. at a kind of typical, at a firm, not quite a typical firm, but at Miller and Chevalier, as we say in the United States, as opposed to Chevalier. But it was a firm with an international practice, not specialized in arbitration as such, although I did have my first arbitration there, but largely with the Washington regulatory practice and Work Practices Act work that was really interesting, and it turns out quite, I don't know, in a sense, prescient when you think about what has later happened in investment arbitration with corruption. I feel a little bit as if my career has gone full circle. But I did there have my first arbitration. It was in London Court of International Arbitration involving a major U.S. multinational and an agent in the Middle East, and they had a little bit of a falling out over how much work the agent had actually done and whether he was entitled to pay for his work.
And after that, you were in the State Department in the early days of NAFTA.
Yeah.
And what did those days look like?
Well, I did. I ended up in the government. I moved, I clerked, and I worked at the International Trade Commission. Then I moved into the NAFTA arbitration division, mostly because a friend of mine from law school said, wow, this is, there's going to be, we have a new position, the work is going to be great, you should really apply. So I did. But the early days were something. I mean, it's hard now. I know that the world has changed vastly, even in the last 25 years. So my first day of work, they didn't have my office ready yet. So I borrowed somebody else's office, and I was basically put in the office with a copy of NAFTA Chapter 11 and told, to read this, you're going to need to know it really well. So I did with no context. Just to be clear, no context. Like, just here's Chapter 11, read it. Okay. And then I started working on the Lowen case, the Mondev case. The other two cases in the office were Methanex and ADF. I didn't work on very much. We all worked a little bit on every case, but my two bigger cases were Lowen and Mondev. And then we also monitored cases against Mexico and Canada to see if the United States would want to file 1128 submissions, which under Chapter 11 are the submissions that the non-disputing party is entitled to file as of right on issues of interpretation of the agreement.
And now, 25, maybe 30 years later, what do you think is the biggest contribution of NAFTA arbitration to ISDS?
Well, I think there are many contributions, but in some ways, I think the single biggest contribution is transparency. And that's because, so transparency, the idea of transparency really arose in NAFTA arbitrations because civil society was getting very interested in these arbitrations, and the early cases had pretty typical confidentiality clauses, but it turned out that we were facing, and Canada was facing, access to information requests. And under the U.S. and the Canadian Freedom of Information Act legislation, there's an exception for kind of court-ordered confidentiality. There's no exception for arbitrator-ordered confidentiality. So and I want to emphasize that it wasn't that the government wanted to keep things confidential. It was more that we were litigating. We had a confidentiality or arbitrating. We had a confidentiality order. We wanted to honor our commitment under the confidentiality order. We wanted to honor the Freedom of Information Act request. So we tried to figure out how we could do that, and the best way to do that, which also fulfilled, I think, our general goal of more transparency, was to say, fine, we're going to we're going to establish a policy that these and agree among the parties that these arbitrations are not confidential. So that's the part, I think, of the note of interpretation from 2001 that gets the least attention, because most people focus on the language limiting Article 1105 to the minimum standard of treatment. But in fact, that was really extraordinarily influential because it also affected all U.S. and Canadian policy and treaties going forward. So they amended their model bits, and all post-2001 agreements involving the U.S. and Canada, and many involving Mexico, although Mexico's policy has not been quite as consistent, but have been confidential, or have been transparent, have excluded confidentiality. And that, so that in itself is, I think, a big contribution. But more than that, the fact that NAFTA arbitrations have been generally in the public domain, and that usually includes procedural orders, party pleadings, memorials, and the awards, non-disputing party submissions, means that jurisprudence, I think, has had an outsized effect, because you can get that information. You can look to see what was decided in Hope and Talbot, what was decided in ADF, what was decided in BuildCon and the like. And so that means that those cases, I think, are extremely influential, and NAFTA jurisprudence has been influential. You also just have the fact that NAFTA had so many procedural provisions, that at the time were innovative, that have now been replicated not just in U.S. and Canadian treaties, but replicated in other treaties as well.
And NAFTA is no longer in force. It has been replaced by the UMCA.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering why.
Well, I could give you a very flip answer, which is President Donald J. Trump, who really was determined to renegotiate NAFTA. And I think that's part of it. You do need to have some political will to reopen an agreement that people might have varying views about the level of success, but I think on the whole, NAFTA has been successful. It's very much instantiated in the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. So if you try to undo it, it's really opening a big kind of can of worms, because the three polities have become so linked with respect to supply chains and the like. So, nobody, I think undoing it caused a lot of alarm among a lot of people. But I think, he wanted to have a signature. I'm not quite sure I can articulate any coherent views about trade, except that he wanted to influence trade and affect trade. And so I think he delighted in saying he was going to terminate NAFTA if it weren't renegotiated. So but it was also true that it was, 30 years later, one of the big additions to NAFTA now is the digital services chapter, which of course the 1994 NAFTA did not have, because we did not really have digital services then. I mean, to go back to my initial time at the state, we did not have investment arbitration reporter. We did not have GAR. We did not have the investor state law guide. I communicated with other government agencies by group fax. So, like on a machine, not, on a machine. So things have changed a lot. So you have the digital trade chapter. You have the addition of some protectionism in the rules of origin for automobiles to essentially protect U.S. manufacturers. And you have the addition of labor and environmental agreements with binding dispute settlement, with essentially more teeth, because you might not remember, but you might have heard that NAFTA actually had two side agreements, one on labor and one on the environment, which is how Washington managed to get NAFTA through, the original NAFTA through the U.S. Congress over labor objections, but those chapters were somewhat aspirational, and certainly dispute settlement under them was virtually non-existent. So the newer provisions of the new NAFTA, what's called CUSMA in Canada, the UMSCA in the United States have stronger labor and environmental provisions.
And if we look more deeply into the ISDS provision of the UMSCA, what has changed in comparison to NAFTA?
Yeah, so that's the extraordinary change. So the kind of piece one is that there is no investor-state dispute settlement as between the United States and Canada. The general feeling is that the reason for that is that Canada really wanted to preserve what under NAFTA was Chapter 19, the trade remedies, the binational panel review for trade remedies legislation. And kind of in return for giving up Chapter 11, they got to keep Chapter 19, meaning which are now different numbers than in the new NAFTA. But that putting me in that room with that NAFTA Chapter 11 was quite formative, because I got to tell you, I still think in terms of NAFTA Chapter 11. So if you tell me something about expropriation, I think Article 1110. If you tell me something about non-disputing party submissions, I think 1128. I'm sure I'll never get over that. So no ISDSs between the U.S. and Canada, limited ISDS between the United States and Mexico. So under Annex 14D, which is the more generally applicable provision, there are a couple of significant changes. Essentially, you can only bring claims for violations of national treatment or most favored nation treatment, or for direct expropriation. So the exclusion there is no minimum standard of treatment, which is NAFTA's version of fair and equitable treatment, you might say, and no claims for indirect expropriation. And there's a requirement of exhausting local remedies for 30 months, so for 2.5 years. Whereas there is a special provision for Annex 14E, which is for investors holding certain covered government contracts, which are contracts with a central government entity in particular sectors. And those investors have access to essentially investor-state dispute settlement as we know it, as was found in Chapter 11. But generally speaking, the way the government is structured, that means U.S. investors in Mexico. Even though formally the chapter is, is symmetrical, there really are not, there aren't the same kinds of government contracts. So you don't have, not only do you not have as many Mexican investors in the United States, those types of contracts just don't really exist. So that is, probably could be viewed as a win for U.S. negotiators. So those are the big changes.
So you mentioned that Canada is not a party to Annex 14D, but it is still a party to Chapter 31, which means that in theory, state-to-state arbitration are possible. And I know that you wrote an article recently after the U.S.-Ecuador case. And so I'm wondering how realistic it is that we will see a state-to-state arbitration.
Yeah, I would say, it's obviously possible. Not sure it quite gets to probable. One of the things that I wrote about this in that chapter, but just generally, governments are not that keen on espousing claims. I mean, it's not I think that's one of the reasons that you have, enduring investor-state dispute settlement is that if the alternative is that the government's going to be asked to take up the claim on behalf of its investor, they're not that interested in doing that. I mean, for one thing, it's an allocation of resources. So that's time and money that could be spent doing something else. Can be politically very sensitive. There are concerns that some investors have more clout than others and are perhaps more likely to have their claims taken up. I think that's probably true, but I also think that governments are sensitive to those claims. So then you have maybe smaller investors who want their claims taken up, or maybe they would have a more sympathetic hearing, maybe. But it is just in order to offset that impression that only well-connected investors get their claims taken, yet you still have this concern about, I think, the political consequences, right? So why would you, if the government is deciding whether or not to take up a case, we have the traditional kind of limitations in diplomatic protection law. The case has to be a good case, so the government has to be convinced that there's a strong likelihood of winning. The investor has to have exhausted local remedies. It's still a discretionary decision, and is it so? Ça vaut la peine? I mean, is it really worth it? There's a case. I usually use this in my classes as an example. But there was a man named Scott Nelson who was a U.S. investor in Saudi Arabia who sought to have the U.S. government espouse his claim in Saudi Arabia in the late 1980s, leading up to 1990. And guess what? The government was not about to espouse his claim against Saudi Arabia. Some of you, I don't know what exactly the demographic is, but there was something very important going on then, and it was the first Gulf War, and the United States was using Saudi airstrips. Like, there was no way the United States government was going to, annoy Saudi Arabia on behalf of Scott Nelson, however meritorious his claim might have been. And that's just, I guess, real politique. I mean, it's a practical limitation there. I've had a conversation with somebody from the government of Canada with respect to the Keystone Pipeline case, and Keystone Pipeline is this long-standing, very politically contentious project to link oil fields from Alberta to a pipeline that would deliver the oil to refineries in the Gulf of Mexico. And the project took a long time to be approved, was actually not approved by President Obama. There was an initial case filed, and President Trump came into office, rescinded the refusal and approved the pipeline, but there were still regulatory hurdles to jump through, and then President Biden came in and rescinded the approval. So there was a new case, and I did have, somebody from the government of Canada saying essentially that Canada was pleased that Keystone could file its case itself. So the government of Canada did not have to decide whether or not to espouse that case. So that's, which makes sense. And I think that is, I think that's going to be true in a lot of different contexts.
And if we switch now to a different topic and to use another hat you have, you are a quarantine observer in Working Group 3. And so I am just wondering, what are the latest news coming out of this group?
So I don't want to misrepresent myself just because I used to go regularly and diligently to the meetings. I'm afraid the length of the process and other commitments have meant that I have not been as present at the meetings as I was, but I'm still following it. And I also have the benefit of having had an update yesterday from Judith Paper from Arbitral, so that was useful in preparation for speaking to you. But certainly there have been a few, achievements. There's a very ambitious work plan, but you have the code of conduct for arbitrators and a separate code of conduct for adjudicators. That was approved, 2 years ago now. Is that right? No, a year ago. A year ago. It's still not enforced, technically, unless parties to a specific arbitration agree to have it apply. But, the goal there, I think, was a laudable one, which was to really try to encapsulate encapsulate the rules, encapsulate the code of conduct for arbitrators in particular, and I think to regularize and make more uniform obligations about disclosure, because I think you still have a difference in views about what should be disclosed. And you have what could be termed largely the North American view, which is, sunshine is the best disinfectant. You just tell everything, and then, people will you're insulating yourself by disclosing everything, and you will not somehow be penalized for that. But you actually, I think, have another view, maybe more prevalent in Europe, where you don't disclose unless there's something to disclose, which essentially means that if you disclose, there might be something there worth looking into, which obviously is, I don't think that's a bad viewpoint, but if you have those two different approaches coming together, and you have the person assessing the disclosure thinking, oh, like there's always stuff to disclose, there must be something, something might be going on here, whereas if you know that you should not be disclosing things like, 20 years ago I had a cup of coffee with somebody, then you don't disclose that. And so I think there's a laudable attempt to just make more uniform what disclosure obligations there are, and thereby try to bridge a little bit that gap and that kind of perception gap. There's also new provisions about agreements to mediate, which can be adopted by parties. There is now a statute on the Advisory Center for International Law, which is kind of an analog to the Advisory Center for WTO law. So that statute was approved, I think, just this last summer at the commission meeting, but it still needs to be operationalized, and that really is code for funded. So I think the stumbling block there, and I think what we're going to see as a possible stumbling block for the court is, which I'll talk about in a minute, is that a lot of these initiatives really cost money, and in a sense, nobody really wants to put a lot of money into them. So the advisory center is, as somebody said to me, it's a great idea, but nobody wants to fund it. And so we'll see. I hope that's not true. I hope somebody does want to fund it, but that's kind of the next stage of that process. And then, of course, we have, then you have the build up to the court. You have the provisions on what are called procedural and cost-cutting issues, which would be, I guess, adopted in the court rules of procedure. Some of these are procedural issues. The cross-cutting issues are the right to regulate and rules about the quantification of damages. Those are not exactly procedural issues, but that's why they're called cross-cutting, apparently. But those will, I think that Judith suggested yesterday that those will be split off for adoption into treaties as opposed to as part of a statute of procedure. But I have to say, even some of the rules that are procedural, it's interesting to try to figure out how they're going to intersect with existing treaties. Because I don't know, I'm assuming you know, but the notion is that if there is a court with this statute, with these procedural rules, that will kind of replace the procedural sections in the treaties of the parties that adhere to the court. Yet, some of the procedural provisions might want to be retained. So it's going to be a little. We're trying to figure out how that can really work. So maybe I should say, some treaties are not necessarily as clear about what is procedure and what is substance, and how you necessarily decide which treaty gets precedence if there is some kind of conflict. So that's something to be worked out. And then finally, you have this question of the court and the court structure. and you have the European Union pretty all in on accord on a two-tier court system with a first instance court that would replace the existing investor state arbitration and an appellate body. And then you have China, for example, which is pretty pro-appellate body, but not first instance courts, and other governments who are skeptical of, I guess, the whole idea. So that is, and bound up in that, of course, and there are many questions. One is enforcement, or one is selection of arbitrators, judges, selection of adjudicators. How are they chosen? Who gets to choose them? How many are there? Who pays for them? Because the notion is that they would be permanent, that they would give up their other job, and probably those people who would be considered think that they should be paid a fairly handsome salary. So as somebody yesterday at the conference I was at, hosted by the German Arbitration Institute, somebody from Hungary said, why would Hungary give money, back to money, why would Hungary give money to a court to pay for a procedure that would hold Hungary liable for damage under its investment treaties? Like, why would Hungary be inclined to give money to that?
Because is what they're doing now when they are paying their shares of it, for instance, or even
but there's only if there's a case.
Yes.
It's not so the proposal, and there's one proposal that each state party to the statute could name 4 judges. Okay. If you're 4 judges, I'm not, the salary were €2,000 a piece. That's a lot, on an ongoing basis. That's a lot of ISDS fees for even. So I think there are some details there to obviously to work out. That there's enforcement. How would these awards be enforced? Would they feed into an existing mechanisms, or would there be a separate enforcement mechanism?
And if we just touch for a second on the appellate body, I'm wondering how will it fit into the existing structure we have?
Yeah, well, that's the $1 million question. So if we look, we really have 2 regimes, right, to think about. One is how it would fit into ICSID, and the second is how it would fit into a New York Convention or say a non-ICSID regime. So ICSID is complicated by the fact that Article 52 of the ICSID Convention says the only remedy for an ICSID award is annulment under the ICSID Convention. So appeal is not annulment. There's the possibility of amending the ICSID Convention, but that is not generally seen as that viable, because you have so many states party. It would be very difficult to amend and very time consuming to amend. I think another possibility would be to have, I think this would be my recommendation, would be to have, say, ICSID 2, to have simply another, you might say, ICSID convention that had the appeal instead of annulment. And by signing on to the appellate body, you would sign on to ICSID 2, and that way you would separate those regimes. Because the third option would be an interstate amendment, where you would say, let's say the Netherlands and Argentina have decided to amend the ICSID convention as between themselves to have appeal rather than annulment. We have first a question whether under international law they can really do that, if the question of annulment versus appeal is really fundamental to the ICSID convention. Second, you have the likely result of that, which would be that if it were possible, you would probably still have enforcement only then in Holland, in the Netherlands, and in Argentina, which is not a broad, robust enforcement regime. So, as I say, you're still going to have that same limitation if you have ICSID too. But I just feel like it's easier and you avoid some of those arguments. I mean, which, as a general matter, I know that there is a theory of drafting conventions and treaties that says you should have constructive ambiguity in them. But I think that should be reserved for issues that you really cannot come to agreement about, or I don't know, that some are deliberately better off being a little bit fuzzy. And I don't think this is one of those. Like, I think anyway. But then you have the second possibility, which is what happens if it's not an ICSID convention, in case you just have a new regime, if you will, a new set of arbitration rules. Again, I have a hard time delinking this from the question of enforcement. But although, so in the first instance, you have this question, let's say we have a set of rules, we have with the possibility with an appellate body, you could, I think, create rules that say that only the appellate body decision is a final award, or that either an ISDS decision or the so you try to do that. If you don't have an appellate body decision, and even then, you still have the question of how it fits into set aside in the place of arbitration, because if you don't have the ICSID convention, are you going to have a place of arbitration? Or are you going to have another national regime? If you have a place of arbitration, like you do for the Iran-U.S. Claims Tribunal in the Netherlands, then you need to have, I guess, some kind of legislation suggesting that, I'm thinking of this for efficiency purposes, that local court cannot set aside the award, so that you don't have duplicative kind of appeals or quasi-appeal mechanisms. But then you have the question of enforcement, and it's, the New York Convention countries, I think you could say this is an award under the New York Convention. I mean, I'm going to set aside difficulties of whether a court procedure is really an arbitral award enforceable under the New York Convention, which is a question. I don't need to dismiss that.
A very big question.
But I'm just, hypothetically assuming it is, and maybe this goes into whether you even want it to be, that if you're going to enforce your award in a New York Convention member state, you're going to have the defenses to enforcement under Article 5 of the New York Convention. So you're going to have, you would in that instance have another procedure, right, another potential level of review, which is arguably inconsistent with goals of efficiency. And as Shay has just said, this, you might say the whole goal of having this court is that you don't have an arbitral award. So can you really then say, oh, but this is an arbitration for New York Convention purposes, and we want all of the courts in New York Convention member states to honor that decision, even though, again, kind of the whole goal of the process is to not have an arbitral award, which is, yes, a fundamental issue.
That lawyers will have a lot of work in the future.
Yes, full employment for lawyers. We're all for that.
And to finish, I would like to ask you a much lighter question, which is, what are your tips for newcomers in this field, especially in light of what we just said?
I'll say I did have probably about 5 years ago, I think before COVID, I had a student come into my office, and after class in which we talked about, I think, criticisms of investment arbitration and the UMSCA process, which I think at the time had just gotten underway. And the student said, Professor Bjorklund, what are you going to do if investment arbitration goes away? What will you do? And I said, okay, first, I don't really think it's going away anytime soon. I have other interests and it'll be okay. But on the lighter note, I mean, maybe on a more serious side, I think for the most part, and you would be not just because of what's happening with the UMSCA Working Group 3, but just generally, there are very few people who can really do investment arbitrations and only investment treaty arbitrations. and most of them have several years of experience doing other things, and most of them probably do some commercial arbitration as well, even if it's not their preferred, maybe not their preferred intellectual activity. So I would not think that you have to or should pigeonhole yourself into doing only investment arbitration. I also think that the old-fashioned advice that we used to get is good, is that it can be very useful to have a substantive specialty. I was talking to somebody just the other night about, corporate law, about having our attorneys who really understand how transactions are structured, how investments are structured, and that helps them if they move into arbitration or litigation. That really helps them. I think oil and gas, I think you have several prominent now kind of independent arbitrators who, cut their teeth on oil and gas work, so they really understand that. Maybe that's not a good advice. That particular sector is not the best advice for the future. Maybe I should say renewables. Maybe I should say rare earth minerals. But I do think having some experience in a particular industry, whether you gain that experience in litigation, which is possible because if you're litigating a really complex case, you'll learn a lot about that industry, or whether it's through transactions. So I guess it's always easy to be in a hurry, but I try not to be in too big a hurry to get to the exact, what you think of as the exact place you want to go. I think also having what you might call parallel or transferable skills or expertise can be useful. So one of the biggest ways to get experience in international law, and especially in public international law, is to work for the government, usually for the foreign ministry. And that might mean doing something not related to investment at all. I mean, it might mean doing environmental work. It might mean getting, if you will, into the, I'm going to call it the civil service, but whatever is, however the government is structured in your country, and to do work in that area. It's governments, I find, still, even in this day of the internet and, lots of information, it's still much easier to move from one government job to another government job. You're more likely to hear about openings. You're more likely to understand what it is they're looking for. You're more likely to be shortlisted. So looking for a job in the government is, I think, exceptionally useful. I think it's great for your own development, your development of your knowledge and your skills. I think it's great for the development of your practical knowledge about how governments work, which any organization is a little hard to penetrate from the outside. So I think that can be extremely useful. And then I guess I would say, look for opportunities. You might be lucky like I was and have, somebody say, you should really apply for this job. So that's something to consider. But look for things like ITA, young ITA, I'm old ITA, but look for opportunities to network, look for opportunities to do things like what Shay is doing here, and I guess most importantly, follow through. If you say you will do something, follow through. Be one of the people who can be relied upon to do what they say they'll do, because it's easy to get busy and to say, oh, that sounds fascinating. Sure, you can count on me, and then maybe not to follow up. So be one of the people who follows up. That might sound like really, low, kind of ridiculous advice, but you would be surprised at the number of people who do not follow up. And I'm going to guess that your law school experience is much like mine, but we would have, calls for volunteers to work on a project. At the first meeting, there would be 20 people, and at the second meeting, there would be 10 people, and at the third meeting, there would be the 4 people who really did the work on the project. So I would say be one of those 4 people. Pick and choose. Make sure it's something you care about, but then do the follow through, and you will get noticed and recognized, and you will have more possibilities of learning about opportunities.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for joining me today in Berlin. It was a pleasure discussing with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shay, for having me.
And thank you for joining another episode of Arbitral Voices. In the next one, we'll be back in Washington, D.C., so stay tuned.